Welcome to Europe 6 in Christian Schism, or Byzantine 6, whichever you want to call it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, wherever and whenever you are watching this. I hope you do find it interesting. I'll do my best to keep it as brief and painless as possible, but do please remember to prepare for your test Wednesday. Our goal will be the same as it has been for several days, and that's to identify how Christianity spread differently between the East and the West. As you hear me talking and explaining things further, I'm going to be putting up the slides in their entirety so you can copy down accordingly. Today we'll focus on two separate entities. First, religious orders, and then we'll spend most of our time over in focusing on that schism, the Great Schism of 1054. But first, these religious orders. Right? The religious orders first arise in the year 529 with the Benedictines, founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia from the Italian peninsula. The Benedictines will spread all throughout both Western and Eastern Christianity, and their predecessors were much less formalized, right? The Benedictines will have a particular rule or constitution, so to speak, that they will all agree to and follow. Whereas before this, you basically had very small groups or even individuals called hermits, right, who would maybe go out into the middle of the desert. They tended to be very eccentric, eating things like locusts and wearing, camel skin and stuff like that. But anyways, when these religious orders begin to arise, they have a particular purpose, and that is to set themselves and other Christians on the right practice or exercising of the Christian faith. Right? Some of them are concerned that the church is losing sight of its main focus due to worldliness, right? The tendency for us to want to focus more on what's going on in the world, right? Money and politics. Christianity, like every other civilization that we've looked at, will be plagued by the same issues. They'll have disease, they'll have corruption, they'll have good emperors and bad emperors. We've already seen that with Justinian, right? Right, but this first religious order, the Benedictines, last a long time as basically the only player. These other ones that are going to come afterwards will arise not because they have a different belief within Christianity, but because they have a different way of wanting to practice it. Right? So the beliefs will be the exact same, but they will exercise it differently. You see there four that we'll look at: the Benedictines, the Cistercians, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans. All four of these have their origins in the West, though they will spread to both Western and Eastern Christianity. There is a video on monasticism, but you can view that on your own. The Cistercians, you see there in 1098, they want a simpler lifestyle and religious ceremony, right? Over time, Christianity, and the Benedictines in particular, had made things very beautiful with lots of artwork, lots of music. And so the religious ceremonies are getting longer and longer and more intricate and more complex. And there's great beauty to it. The Cistercians would even acknowledge that, but they want a simpler version of all of this. So again, the beliefs will stay the same, but rather than have all sorts of intricate painted walls, they might have, crosses here and there, a crucifix. They're going to have all the things, all the necessities, and that's about it. Okay, they don't want all the extra. So a simpler spiritual life, though really very similar. They'll focus on worship, prayer, giving to the poor, manual labor, just like the Benedictines had done. We have the friars. So To be a friar means you're both a monk and a priest, whereas in the Cistercians and the Benedictines, some of them will be priests, some of them will be monks. Okay, right? Um, the differences being the monks are really there to just live an ordinary spiritual life, whereas the priests are going to be in charge and um, the leaders of the mass and the religious ceremonies and whatnot and the sacraments. Okay, you may not know what all those words mean, and that's okay, right? Don't worry about that. But these two friar religious orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, will be very similar, though emphasize different things. The Franciscans emphasize poverty, and the Dominicans emphasize catechesis or education in the faith. It's the Dominicans that will be instrumental in making sure that people not only believe what they believe, but understand what they claim to believe. Okay? But both of them focus on preaching, go out as missionaries, and help the poor. Right? Almsgiving, a word you may have seen or heard before, just means giving to the poor. Now, moving on to the schism. Right? This is really the more important of the two today. The West and the East will gradually be separating. Hopefully, you've been seeing signs of this in the previous lessons. And there's various reasons. Like usually things, while being simple, are made up of lots of simple things, making it complex, right? So it can be a little complex here, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. They're gradually separating, right? This does not happen overnight. It happens over the course of centuries, right? Largely due to that east-west split that we see from Diocletian, right? So this is 800 years in the making. And really, you could make a claim it's even further than that, right? One reason you have a difference between Latin and Greek. The East is going to increasingly favor Greek, whereas the West will increasingly favor Latin. Even from the onset, the beginning of Christianity, you have a structure that had the potential to lead to something like this. You have what you call patriarchates or patriarchs in Christianity, and they're just leaders of the church, very important leaders of the church. They would all be bishops, so that means they're a descendant of the apostles. They could trace their ordinations back to the apostles, right? Ordination meaning, right, when they became a bishop. So, in other words, right, reminding us that that concept of apostolic succession, you have the original 12 disciples of Jesus. Each of them is a bishop. They then create new bishops. Those bishops create new bishops, etc. And so they could all trace their heritage, so to speak, all the way back to those original 12. Okay, that's the idea here. But these five patriarchs were the most important. Four of them were in the east. You see there Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. And one in the west at Rome. And the one in the west, all this time, throughout the centuries, was acknowledged to be the first among equals. Right? So everyone was in agreement there that if there was ever a controversy or a final say that needed to be said, right, if there was a disagreement, ultimately the patriarch in the West, the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, would get to determine that. Now, it wasn't necessary often, but it was a last resort sort of thing, okay? And everybody acknowledged it. All right, but you can see here you have four in the east, so you have regional loyalty to your specific patriarch. It makes sense, right? If you live around Jerusalem, you're probably going to be more likely to listen to the patriarch in Jerusalem. If you live around Constantinople, you're going to be more likely to listen to that bishop or patriarch. Whereas in the West, if you're in present day Spain, if you're in present day France, if you're in present day North Africa, Italy, You're listening to who? The bishop in Rome, the patriarch in Rome, because there's only one. Okay? That's the one you're closest to. And so the East, you can already see, has that potential to kind of splinter, and it will. And this sets the stage for a schism or a formal split or separation between the two. Continuing on with this split, the Pope will continue to lead the Catholic Church in the West. Catholic now with a capital C. I introduced it to you before with a lowercase c, meaning universal. Whereas the Emperor, not the patriarchs, will lead the Orthodox Church in the East. Right? Orthodox with a capital O, meaning reference to that particular church. Whereas with a lowercase o, Orthodox comes from orthodokos in Greek. Ortho meaning right, right, meaning correct, and dokos meaning opinion. So if you are Orthodox with a lowercase o, that means that you are of the correct opinion or the correct beliefs. So you could describe both of these churches as Orthodox, right? So just keep that in mind. There's a difference between capital C Catholic, capital O Orthodox, and lowercase c Catholic, lowercase o Orthodox. It's an important distinction to remember just for the rest of your life. The words are not necessarily referring to the same thing all the time. So don't get me wrong, even though the emperor will be in charge in the East, the patriarchs will, of course, be influential and help, but they're going to answer to the emperor. Whereas in the West, the church is in charge of the churchy things, and in the East, the government's in charge of the churchy things. So, some basic reasons for the split that we'll investigate further: power, differences in culture, something called the iconoclasm heresy, and the straw that broke the camel's back, the filioque. It's a bit of a scapegoat here, but it's important to at least be aware of it. All right. Now, we'll go through 1, 2, and 4 on the next slide, but briefly about the iconoclasm heresy. You see there the dates. It happens twice. And if you think back to our previous units, there's something that has been gaining power in the Middle East that might have influenced this idea of iconoclasm, right? Hopefully you remember iconoclastic, image, destroy image. If you remember, Islam, right? You can't have images. You can't depict images, human images, or even animal images, usually in artwork. Okay, and so this spills over into Eastern Christianity. You never really see this in the West, but in parts of the East, it's always going to be a minority of opinion, but it's a large enough group that it causes a controversy a couple of times. Now, the East will ultimately condemn the iconoclasts, right? Those who think that they should not have the images, all right? But it does last there, for about 100 years. All right, so power first, right? The Pope in the West will claim that he's God's representative on earth, having power over the emperors. Okay, at least in matters of the church. He's not going to claim that power so much as a political ruler, though of course he will become a political ruler as well. But the emperor claims he's God's representative and has power over the church. Usually the one in charge is the one with the sharp, pointy things, right? The spears, the swords, the military. You control the military in this day and age, you ultimately have the final say, right? So the emperor is going to have all that power in the East. You also have language there. Already mentioned this: Greek in the East, Latin in the West. Just different cultures, right? Neither one's correct, neither one's incorrect, but they're just different. Then you have the filioque. There's a typo there that should be Filioque. It's just a Latin word that means "and the Son." If you really want more details on this, feel free to look them up on your own or ask me. I'd be happy to explain it further. But you have something called the Nicene Creed that the church agrees upon in the 4th century. And both really all everywhere throughout Christianity had been saying this Nicene Creed at every church service, right? They would. This is a list of beliefs of basic Christian beliefs, and there's a heresy going on at the time called Arianism, and it had been a problem for centuries. And basically, in Arianism, they overemphasized Jesus's humanity over his divinity. And long story short, it was not the correct belief, and it was causing some pretty big issues both in the West and the East. And so the West finally decided, you know what, we're going to do something. Let's change the creed and add in this clarifying word. The East didn't like it and used it as a way to say, nope, this is it. You've now changed the Nicene Creed without our permission. We're going to leave. Okay, so really, it's kind of a scapegoat. Think of it that way. Filioque is a scapegoat, but it is ultimately what is cited, what is said to be the reason why they split. Okay, right. This is the reason the East gives. And so that finally happens in the year 1054. You have now two different churches, the Orthodox and the Catholic churches. Though this will not be the last time that they are unified. They will come back and reunify a couple of times. Most recently in 1439, it's either 37 or 39, sorry guys, one of the two, at the Council of Florence. But then what happens afterwards, you might know, the fall of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. And so, long story short, that reunification never really materializes. Okay. And so today you still have a Catholic and Orthodox church. If you have any further questions, please email me or talk to me at school. I'm happy to help. Study, study, study. Don't forget your vocab. I know you all are going to do great. Depending on when you're watching this, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend and the rest of your day. All right. See you all soon.